You are wrong about Galadriel in the Rings of Power. In the last couple weeks, I have read every reference to Galadriel in The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, and Unfinished Tales, and I can tell you that you are wrong about Galadriel in the Rings of Power. We all are. Welcome back to The Librarian of the Rings. My name is Ben, and I'm the librarian, and today we're talking about why you are wrong about Galadriel in the Rings of Power. There has been a lot of controversy surrounding the Rings of Power, both when Season 1 came out a couple years ago, and now leading up to the release of Season 2 here in a couple weeks as of the recording of this video. And while there's been lots of things that people have complained about, perhaps nothing has caused more controversy than the character of Galadriel. Tons of hate around Galadriel has been slung the way of the writers, the showrunners, and even Morfydd Clark, the actress who portrays Galadriel in the Rings of Power. And this just needs to stop, because the truth is, you are all wrong about Galadriel. How is it that everybody is wrong about Galadriel? Well, it's pretty simple. There just aren't right answers about Galadriel. So let me just read you a passage from Unfinished Tales where Christopher Tolkien writes about this. There is a chapter in here called Of Galadriel and Celeborn. Celeborn is Galadriel's husband, if you didn't know. But in the introduction to Unfinished Tales, this is what Christopher Tolkien says. The history of Galadriel and Celeborn is an unfinished tale in the larger sense. A primary strand in the history of Middle-earth that never received a settled definition, let alone a final written form. The inclusion of the unpublished narratives and sketches of narrative on this subject therefore entails at once the acceptance of the history not as fixed, independently existing reality which the author reports in his persona as translator and redactor, but as a growing and shifting conception in his mind when the author has ceased to publish his works himself after subjecting them to his own detailed criticism and comparison. The further knowledge of Middle-earth to be found in his unpublished writings will often conflict with what is already known. So you can see there, this is just a struggle. Christopher goes on, and in the chapter itself on Galadriel and Celeborn writes this. There is no part of the history of Middle-earth more full of problems than the story of Galadriel and Celeborn, and it must be admitted that there are severe inconsistencies embedded in the traditions, or, to look at the matter from another point of view, that the role and importance of Galadriel only emerged slowly, and that her story underwent continual refashionings. And those continual refashionings were never done. Tolkien never reached a point where he was satisfied with the story of Galadriel. And even the things that were published in The Lord of the Rings appeared to be up for debate for Tolkien himself, because he would make adjustments to it and adjust those adjustments, and we never got a complete and concluded narrative on the history of Galadriel and who she was. So this character is really complicated, it's really difficult to deal with, and what you think you know about her probably isn't necessarily true. It might be something that was true at one point, something that Tolkien wrote at one point, or it might be something that wasn't even real at all. One of the primary problems I think people have with Morfydd Clark's portrayal of Galadriel is that most people are thinking of Cate Blanchett's portrayal of Galadriel. That character from Peter Jackson's trilogy is deep-seated in a lot of people's visions of what Galadriel is, even though it's not really accurate to the books either, not to The Lord of the Rings itself or to the other posthumously published works about Galadriel. So there's just so much here that you just kind of have to wrap your mind around to even understand, and you have to become really comfortable with contradiction.
It is only natural to feel conflicted
When it comes to Galadriel's character. So now you might be wondering, well, are there any attributes of Galadriel that we can hold fast to that are actually firm? And there's a few. There's a few that are really consistent across all of Tolkien's different writings, and most of them have to do with her physical appearance. First of all, she is tall, like really tall. She is almost always described as being tall, usually taller than most other people. She is blonde. I mean, she is always blonde. She always has golden hair, and the hair is really important in some of the narratives because it is the last reflection of the light of the trees in Valinor, the last surviving thing that reminds people of the trees. And so in some of these narratives, it plays a really important part, but it is always blonde, always golden. Also, she has white skin. She always does. Sorry, MTG. Can't really help you out with that one. And then as far as her qualities go, well, she's proud. That is probably her number one defining character trait across the stories, is she is a proud character. She also always has this desire to rule. She has a desire to be in charge of things, to rule a kingdom. That is fairly consistency, although not entirely consistently, her primary reason for coming to Middle-earth from Valinor, is to rule a kingdom of her own, which she eventually does. Those are the things that we can feel really confident in Galadriel on, and everything else is kind of up for grabs. The other thing that you have to understand when you're comparing Morfydd Clark's Galadriel to Cate Blanchett's is that you have an entire age that takes place in between those two. Even if those two characters seem inconsistent, and they don't necessarily need to be brought into consistency because they're different stories with different storytellers, but even if they were trying to bring them into consistency, Galadriel has a long arc to go from where she is in Rings of Power to where she is in Lord of the Rings. So those two characters can be consistent, and you need to not compare where she's starting at in Rings of Power with where she ends up in the Lord of the Rings, either in the films or in the actual books, which are two very different things, of course. So if we were to pick one thing that is a problem with Morfydd Clark's portrayal of Galadriel, it's nothing that Morfydd Clark can really do anything about without some serious special effects, and that is her height. She just isn't that tall. Now, can we forgive that? I think so. I've mentioned before that Viggo Mortensen wasn't tall enough to play Aragorn, and everyone seems to have forgiven him just fine. So I think we can move on from that particular point. Now, with that out of the way, what are some things where they seem to be getting it right? Well, Morfydd Clark's portrayal of Galadriel is really proud. I mean, pride is probably her biggest defining characteristic in the show, and that matches up. That is Galadriel's most defining characteristic. Now, is she more tempered by the time she gets to the Lord of the Rings? Of course she's more tempered in the Lord of the Rings because she's like way older. Guess what? You change as you grow. That's a normal part of development, both for humans and for elves. Other than those things, pretty much everything's up for grabs, and I think you would be hard-pressed to not be able to find some reference that they are probably looking at when they make a choice about Galadriel's character in the Rings of Power. Pretty much everything they do has something that they're backing up to in the actual texts of the Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion, or Unfinished Tales. Now, they technically can't adapt the stories in the Silmarillion or Unfinished Tales. They can certainly try and weave those character traits that might be found there into it. And again, a lot of these are inconsistent, maybe even contradictory. So just as a few examples of things that were not settled and were still on Tolkien's mind as he was writing, pretty much up until his death, were questions as fundamental as who Galadriel's children were, where her family history came from, where Celeborn, her husband's family history came from, where she lived and traveled to in Middle-earth during her lifetime, what her motivations were for the things that she did. All of these are things that were still up for grabs up until the end of Tolkien's life and were unsettled. And so you can take Galadriel's character as an adapter a lot of different ways. That's just the truth of the matter. I was going to go through every single reference to Galadriel in the text, but I didn't want this to be the longest video in the history of videos, so I'm not going to go through each reference, but I do want to point out a few things that people have complained about in Rings of Power, and this isn't all of them, there's a lot of them, but let's take it right from the beginning. Galadriel in the North. As the leader of the Northern armies, Galadriel seems kind of intense and furious and really pushes her soldiers. And people have said that that's not consistent with Galadriel's character, but really it probably is. Galadriel in one of the versions of the tale survived the Helcaraxa, and didn't just survive the crossing of the Helcaraxa, she led the people across the Helcaraxa. So being in the north of Middle-earth, where it's cold as all get out, is nothing compared to crossing the ice waste for 144 years.
Long can living flesh endure where even sunlight fears to tread.
So, of course, she's going to be a little bit intense because she's already done something harder than this. She knows it's possible, and she is driven to defeat Sauron. Now, that's another point that people have complained about. Galadriel's drive to defeat Sauron.
They called him Sauron.
Well, it's certainly there in The Lord of the Rings, but it's also really there in some parts of Unfinished Tales, to the point where it says that she chose not to leave Middle-earth because she was driven to stay there until Sauron was completely defeated. Which brings us to another point. Galadriel jumping off the boat on the way to Valinor. Why would she do this, people say? Well, she had this drive to defeat Sauron, and that is present in the text for sure. Galadriel being able to go back to Valinor at all is definitely up for debate. It's kind of a weird thing in the show, but it's also a weird thing in Tolkien's own writings. The Band of Galadriel from Valinor is treated a lot of different ways in the text, and it's certainly present for sure. She needs to do something in order to be able to come back in most of the stories. Not all of them, but in most of them. And even if she did have the chance, she feels the need to stay and defeat Sauron. So that's there. Is it a little ridiculous to jump off the boat in the middle of the ocean? I guess so, but it doesn't seem completely inconsistent with Galadriel's character. Okay, there's lots of other ones, but one other one that's come up is Galadriel's kind of violence and her fighting nature in the Rings of Power. Now, certainly as a younger person, she would probably be more rash, but you don't even need to leave the text of Lord of the Rings to find out that Galadriel can fight. Galadriel is the one responsible for casting down Dol Guldur at the end of the Lord of the Rings. She repels the forces of Sauron from Lorien 3 times, and then goes and wipes out Dol Guldur along with Celeborn and Thranduil. And so definitely Galadriel can fight. This isn't really inconsistent with her character at all, maybe just in your perception of her character as portrayed by Cate Blanchett in the Jackson films. Okay, I don't want this video to keep going on forever, so we are going to pause there. But if you have specific questions about scenes from the Rings of Power, either season 1 or as season 2 comes out about Galadriel's character, go ahead and drop them them down in the comments below, and I'm happy to see if I can find where I think they might be pulling that from in the text, because it's really helpful to go back to the text and see, is there something that these showrunners are pulling from as they develop these characters. Now, I really encourage you to go and read this yourself.
Take a look, it's in a book.
Read the Silmarillion to learn about Galadriel's character there. She's a pretty minor character as far as Silmarillion characters go, but she is present there. And also read Unfinished Tales. That's one of the best places to kind of get a sense for really how unfinished her story actually was. Now, if you do go ahead and leave things in the comments, like with all of my videos dealing with controversial subjects, I'll be moderating all of the comments. So if you want your comment posted, make sure that you stay nice, cite your sources, and use appropriate language. If not, then your comment is unlikely to see the light of day. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, farewell wherever you fare. May your ears receive you at your journey's end.